Okay, I'm Ian Miller, and I am joining you from the northwest of Ireland. I practice in Dublin, and right now I'm a refugee from the Irish housing crisis. So I'm a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst, and you can ask me anything else. Ready to go. Today, I want to talk about psychoanalysis as a defiantly Jewish science. And I want to thank Daniel for his book on Jung, which I found enormously helpful. And I will paraphrase you early on in this. Okay. The bizarre term Jewish science, the gift of German racism eventuating in the Shoah, has been applied to only two domains: Einstein's physics and Freud's psychoanalysis. The first indication that psychoanalysis might be so perceived hails defensively from Freud himself and his short-lived concretized attempt to assimilate psychoanalysis into the larger world by physical elevation of a non-Jew, Carl Jung, as the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. What constitutes Jewish science? From Freud's perspective, it was the idea that non-Jews would derogate psychoanalytic discoveries as the foul product of a historically hated people. Certainly, this is how Jung demeaned Freud's original inquiries into the construction of jokes, following the hermeneutic pattern similarly discovered in the earlier study of dreams. Jung reduced Freud's interest to an intellectualized study of wit, mistaking entirely that studying the dynamics of wit had occupied German psychology, secular psychology, for generations. Clearly, the fact of scientists' ethnicity is a signifier of Jewish science, but there are a swirl of interactive criteria that also tick the box. Whether, for example, reference is made to Jewish textual or ritual contents. Whether a Jewishly discernible communicative style is recognized by non-Jewish critics, and whether some stereotypic cultural markers affixed to scientific pursuit, such as liberalism, aspirations to greater human freedom, or the psychological point of view of which Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi writes, indicative of Freud himself, that, quote, alienated from classical Jewish texts, psychological Jews tend to insist on inalienable Jewish traits: intellectuality and independence of mind, the highest ethical and moral standards, concern for social justice, tenacity in the face of persecution. These are among the qualities they will claim if called upon as quintessentially Jewish, unquote. The ambivalently marked fact of Jewishness has traveled within psychoanalysis from its origins, reflected accurately both in Freud's defensiveness and in external perceptions of psychoanalysis as tainted by Jewishness, including observations by non-Jewish practitioners. Its ugliness is recognized both boldly and in whispers, from the Nazi closure and renaming of the Berlin Psychoanalytic and the subsequent splitting of German psychoanalysis, with now unified parts both included and excluded from international membership following World War II, to Lacan's arch comment in the early 1950s that refugees, Jewish psychoanalysts in the United States were, quote, Pharisees and shopkeepers, 1953. To Jung's renowned championing of Wotan and Aryan psychology, to Ernest Jones' characterization of Jews' Hittite noses and predilection to intellectual superiority, coupled with his recipe for Jewish assimilation and disappearance, finally assimilating with Gentiles. And of course, to the most significant anti-Semitic marker in the Anglophone psychoanalytic literature, the translation of the Grottic Freud term das Es, the it, to the id, the elision by Strachey and Jones of a London street slur in faux Latinate English, forever instantiating the Jew, the Yid, as the uncanny unconscious of humanity. The present paper doubles down on Jung's derogation of Freud's interest in jokes. It examines an aspect of psychoanalytic overdetermination, its doublings, extended by Freud from the literary productions of Heinrich Heine, and so affirms psychoanalysis as a Jewish science that self-consciously references practitioners' identification and exegetic elaboration of ideas discernible both to Jews and non-Jews as Jewish. We follow Freud's reading of a joke excerpted from the Reisbilder or travel pictures of Heinrich or Harry Heine in discerning registrations of multiple unconscious and conscious meanings, fundamental within psychoanalytic psychology. His initial recognition of the Hirsch Hyacinth vignette compresses Heine's wit to what appears as a neologism, folding two words into one, familiarly. But the illuminative meanings of Hirsch Hyacinth remain deceptively complicated, audaciously defiant of Freud's linguistic explanation, and markedly Jewish. In addressing Hirsch Hyacinth, while following Heine's doubled literary form of presentation, Freud's descriptive demonstration mirrors the multiple levels of experience and meaning continuously emergent in the daily work of psychotherapy. Overtly, Freud turns away from Yiddish, which he calls his culturally beloved mother tongue, in the service of developing the objective scientific practice of psychoanalytic method. Rhetorically, he consigns the civilizational elements inherent in multiple Jewish languages to oblivion. He reduces Jewishness to the unlanguaged essentialism of commonly shared large group assumptive fantasy. Quote, the more powerful, the less they could be expressed in words, unquote. Effectively, Freud's strategic move parallels Austro-Hungarian political definition of Jews as a people with neither territorial nor linguistic status. J. Geller observes that following Article 19 of the 1867 Imperial Constitution, the Jews, unlike other nationalities such as the Ruthenians and the Czechs, were recognized as a people, Volksstamm, but not as a nation, Nationalitat. Hence, they had neither language nor territory rights. Every recognized nationality had the right to teach its children in, quote, the language customary to the land, Croat, Czech, German, Magyar, etc. Austro-Hungary recognized 11 national groups and their languages, but the state did not confer such status on either the Jews or their languages, Hebrew and Yiddish. This disability, uniquely extended to emancipated Jewish citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, antedates Freud's similar cultural reduction of Jewishness, but as background to the Austrian Jewishness in which Freud had grown up. In this light, Freud's ambivalent depictions of Jewishness resemble the defensive posture later psychoanalysis recognized as identification with the aggressor in the sphere of Gentile-Jewish relations. Yet, as Freud demonstrates, such identification is incomplete. Freud's strategic definition of Jewishness, depleted of its cultural voice, is contradicted by his counter-narratives, through which vibrantly living forms of Jewish expression, such as those comprising the bulk of his 1905 jokes and their relation to the unconscious, as well as his own literary mirroring of Heine's overtly ambivalent Jewish preoccupations, continue from Hirsch Hyacinth to Moses and monotheism. Within this persistently repetitive doubling, Freud undercuts his formal identification with the conventional Austro-Hungarian portrayal of Jewishness as an unheimlich, ghostly carapace of antiquated civilization in exactly the same way the unconscious illumination of a joke's doubled meaning undercuts its initial premise. While contemporary categorical definition of such culturally emotional striving was unavailable to Freud, its historical, psychological, and associative mimic currents become culturally discernible by the late 20th century in the particular expressive forms that Yerushalmi recognizes as what he calls the faith of fallen Jews. Significantly, these are aspects of Jewishness such as Yerushalmi's own psychological Jew, that result from secular rather than traditional Jewish studies. That is, an understanding of Jewishness already annealed with the Jewish embrace of the modern Gentile world. Significantly, the Hirsch Hyacinth joke functions to illustrate Freud's discernment of psychoanalytic auto-emancipation through interpretive method reliant on subjective particularity, but oriented toward illuminating the universal human condition, and at the same time models Freud's cautiously audacious use of doubling to address the ongoing psychological situation of cultural prejudice, particularized in his participant observer identity as Austro-Hungarian Jew. Freud conveys his doubled psychological reference to a Jewishness he defines as inexpressible in words, yet at the same time actively demonstrates through its particularisms of language and expressive forms, as well as his personified identification with Heine, the creator of Hirsch Hyacinth. We begin with a joke told by Freud. In actuality, Freud doesn't tell his joke, but rather he gestures to the joke in summary. In this way, the disclosure and enlightenment, that is, the yield of the joke, both for teller and listener, lies obscure and distant from its initially conscious surface. Freud, as raconteur, is aware not only of the conscious and unrecognized levels of the joke's meaning, but is also mindful of its intended effect upon the listener. He pays attention to the joke itself and its polyphonic meanings, as well as to his participatory actions in its conveyance to an audience. Freud's skillful presentation parallels the manner in which a joke works through revelations of its doubled meanings. In abstracting from the complex specificity of the joke's contents, Freud describes its mechanics in precise prose. He discerns the triggers that evoke recognition and laughter as an interpersonal psychological creation through the infusion of the joke's surface by a doubling of underlying meanings. But in reading Freud more than a century after the writing of this densely constructed text, contemporary readers face a challenge that is also central within clinical practice. We engage an experiential field defined between amnesia and oblivion, with amnesia representative of the generative pole from which memory might be evoked. Oblivion represents its opposite pole, evocative of nothing at all, as the requisite experience upon which recognition depends is missing or obscured by gestural repetitions operating beneath linguistic vocalization. As in the practice of psychotherapy, where living through or learning from experience must be wrested from meaningless repetition, so too the integration of what has become dissociated from within literary historical memory is crucial in recovering meaning from textual oblivion in psychoanalytic history. Contemporary psychoanalysis, mindful of annihilative human destruction, societal dislocation, large group social dynamics, xenophobia, the binocularity between individual subjectivity and external group experience, and the necessity of integrating history's external facts within internal subjectivity, extends a psychoanalytic method founded by Freud into a 21st century future of which Freud had no experience. Unlike Freud's recognition of societal racism in its characterization of Jewishness as genetic infirmity, believed through Lamarckian distortion to have been transmitted by the intergenerational covenantal practice of male circumcision, in fascinated focus upon the Jewish phallus as congenitally feminized within the Habsburgian social imaginary. Today's psychoanalysis celebrates civilizational aspects of Jewishness in relation to their wealth of psychoanalytic contribution. I first wrote this before October 7th, so there's very little celebration any longer these days. To the end of Freud's life, he would express an oscillation of regard and disdain for Jewishness, repeating in his own Moses and Monotheism, Heine's poetic dedication to the new Israelite hospital in Hamburg, writing of Jewish disease, that Jewishness itself is, quote, the 1,000-year-old family affliction, the plague they carried from the grim Nile Valley, the old Egyptian faith, so long unhealthful. Heine's intergenerational hope for Jews, conveyed textually to Freud. Oh, sorry, help me get out of this. Heine's intergenerational hope for Jews, which was conveyed textually to Freud, continues with a question suggesting that Bildung, or the German language educative practice of self-formation, might generate a solution through Enlightenment's rationality in curing this great incurable malady. And in fact, Heine wrote that perhaps his grandchild or his grandchildren's generation would be freed from Jewishness, and his Freud would have been in his grandchildren's generation. Heine writes, will time, eternal goddess, someday end it? Root out this black misfortune that the fathers hand down to sons, and someday will the grandsons be healed and whole and rational and happy. Heine's disruptive and provocative voice, sometimes darkly condemning, sometimes praising, and frequently mocking both Jewish and Gentile cultures, articulates the mid-20th century epitome of marginal man, partaking variably and ambivalently in multiple cultural identifications. His voice is relatively unknown today, especially within Anglophone psychoanalysis, but not for Freud, who recognizably enlists Heine as his own rhetorical double, the object of his study, as well as the voice into which he can slip. What is uncanny in Freud's text is the regularity with which Heine's voice appears in this manner. Freud's poetics of quotation reveal themselves to be a politics of quotation. His appropriation of Heine's voice in the scientific context of psychoanalytic theory reveals itself to be a dialogue with the voice of the Jew within a discourse initially labeled as scientific, but also understood by Freud within his own thought collective as Jewish. Heine remains for Freud the sign of the double bind of being both the authoritative voice of the observer and the ever suspect voice of the patient, a voice which remains one of the signs and symptoms of the disease from which Heine and Freud suffered, their Jewishness. Recognizing this of Freud and Heine, we turn to Freud's joke sample, his literary case presentation of Hirsch Hyacinth. Freud begins his particular academic demonstration of the joke with concentration upon a single aspect of humor, what he calls the factor of bewilderment and illumination. He then leads the reader through an allusion to Kant upon the general nature of the comedic before proceeding to G. Heymann's 1896 commentary upon bewilderment and illumination, itself elaborating a dimension of the comic made by Theodor Lipps. Boldly, Freud now reveals his active participation in this imagined debate, his own mental representation of an academic symposium about the dynamics of psychology extending across a century of enlightenment. Freud reintroduces a joke originally used as an example by Heymann's by writing that Heine makes one of his characters, Hirsch Hyacinth, the poor lottery agent, boast that the great Baron Rothschild had treated him quite as his equal, quite familiarly. Here, the word that is the vehicle of the joke appears at first simply to be a wrongly constructed word, something unintelligible, incomprehensible, puzzling. It accordingly bewilders. The comic effect is produced by the solution of this bewilderment, by understanding the word. Lipps adds to this that the first stage of enlightenment, that the bewildering word means this or that, is followed by a second stage in which we realize that this meaningless word has bewildered us and has then shown us its true meaning. It's only the second illumination, this discovery that a word which is meaningless by normal linguistic usage has been responsible for the whole thing, the resolution of the problem into nothing. It is only this second illumination, that produces the comic effect. Freud next gestures to a more pointedly a particular form of doubling in the Hirsch Hyacinth sample through a revelation that this example of wit is no joke at all, but a statement of an uncomfortably born societal alienation within which both Heine and Freud are embedded, respectively, to their own bewilderment. Addressing this issue, obliquely if boldly, within the context of his imagined symposium with Kant, Lipps, and Heymann, Freud writes, and I quote, "What Heine has put into Hirsch Hyacinth's mouth is a correct and acute observation, an observation of unmistakable bitterness, which is understandable in a poor man faced by such great wealth. But we should not venture to describe it as in the nature of a joke. If anyone is unable, in considering the translation, to get away from his recollection of the shape given to the thought by the poet, and thus feels that nevertheless the thought in itself is also in the nature of a joke, we can point to a sure criterion of the joking character having been lost in the translation." Freud recognizes that this joke discloses a significantly grave fact. Heine's poetic observation of the bitterness of Jewish suffering, emitted through the vehicle of Hirsch Hyacinth's mouth. But now cautious, Freud goes no further. Indeed, his silence is deafening as he leaves the reader only marginally advanced along the path from bewilderment to illumination. Perhaps the particular suffering to which he alludes might genuinely concern one Jew's envious desire for another Jew's wealth. This interpretation would be congruent with traditional anti-Semitic derogation, so probably sufficient to make the Heine example laughable for some. But knowing Freud as we do, such limitation, while sufficient, lacks necessity. Alternatively, Freud seems engaged in the psychological action of doubling, of demonstrating a ghost-like and uncannily unheimlich resonance, which remains inexplicit, so formally undisclosed. Like the dynamism of the joke itself, it is as if an alter ego undoes the ostensible placidity of social presentation. If so, Freud signals one rendition of his interpretive story at one level, while signaling a counter rendition of the story at another level, exactly the disruptive marker of the psychoanalytic double. Here, Freud, mindful of Heine's original contextual location of Hirsch Hyacinth in a section of his work called The Baths of Lucca, stylistically mirrors Heine's own subversive presentation of doubling, as if with an insider's wink that those in the know will recognize what is meant. Hamevin yavin. Modern readers are aware that historically, Austrian Jewry was caught in a double bind. The Viennese society into which many sought admission demanded complete assimilation, even to the point of obliterating any traces of Judentum. Yet, often accompanying the demand was the conjoined assumption that Jews were constitutionally incapable of eliminating their difference. The man who Freud considered his contemporary literary doppelganger, Arthur Schnitzler, observed that such Jewishness remained conspicuously and painfully present in everyday Viennese life, where there was neither respite nor exit from this social condition. This societal force induced a hyperconscious state of self-awareness upon the individual, the sense of one's own threateningly sinister alter ego imposed socially, psychoanalytically framed by Rank as a double, such that, and here this is Schnitzler from The Road into the Open, it was not possible for a Jew, not in public life, to ignore the fact that he was a Jew. Nobody else was doing so, not the Gentiles and even less the Jews. You had the choice of being counted as insensitive, obtrusive, and fresh, or of being oversensitive, shy, and suffering from feelings of persecution. And even if you managed somehow to conduct yourself so that nothing showed, it was impossible to remain completely untouched. As, for instance, a person may not remain unconcerned whose skin has been anesthetized, but who has to watch with his eyes open how it is scratched by an unclean knife, even cut until the blood flows. The situation described by Schnitzler and lived by Freud and Heine has been described as an existential aporia, placing Jews in a no man's land of cultural homelessness, resident in Germany or Austria, but with a socially induced self-consciousness through racial objectification as society's other in a dichotomized and xenophobic social world, split into mutually negating depictions of us and them. Immediately recognizable to the fin de siècle German readers of the Hirsch Hyacinth joke is the character's hyphenated name. Hirsch is the original German name, a Jewish name, and Hyacinth, the post-baptismal name of the character, just as its author, another HH, who's Heinrich Heine, was originally known as Harry Heine, and after his baptism, Heinrich Heine. The social psychology, oh, by the way, I should say that Freud also circumcised his name. His name was Sigismund, not Sigmund. And that was his name at the point of his bar mitzvah when he changed it. The Sigismund was in an homage to a Polish king who had been particularly kindly to the Jews. Sigmund was a more appropriate, less definitive pointer to his Jewishness. The social psychological context for Freud's Hirsch Hyacinth is within Heine's sarcastic depiction of German Jewish bourgeois pleasure in the Tuscan spa resort of Lucca. Here, Heine archly observed, is where the imperfectly acculturated Jews have opportunistically fantasized an escape route to the inescapable Gentile Jewish dilemma through baptism, as what he calls the entry ticket to European culture. This attempted, if impossible, escape reduces confessional faith to the throughput of religious conversion companies as a newly Christian. Heine's characters now revel in hopeful awareness that the freedoms and pleasures of societal acceptance will be theirs, ambivalently self-conscious that, as he puts it, the Jews have cornered the Christian market. Freud's own Signorelli dream specimen, which every trainee examines, presented both in the interpretation of dreams and the psychopathology of everyday life, reflects contextual similarity to Heine's depiction of assimilated German-Jewish interaction in the baths of Lucca. Freud arrives at the universal nature of dream dynamics via the elemental particularities of the dreamer's specific.
You're muted, Ian.
I'm sorry, it's my mistake. Sorry. Can you unmute yourself, please? Ian?
Yes.
Yes. I apologize.
Okay.
I wanted to tell you that we're close to the end, and by mistake,
Okay. What was the last thing you heard?
I thought he has an hour to speak.
No. What was the last thing that I said that you heard? Did you hear about Lucca?
We heard about Freud circumcised his name, and for Polish monarch.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Ina. So what happens is that both Heine and Freud changed their names, and Heine sets the scene of his story in the Italian town of Lucca, which is a spa that imperfectly Christianized Jews now attend in the hope of being seen as Christians under the notion that Jews have cornered the Christian market. Now, Freud's own Signorelli dream specimen, which almost every psychoanalytic trainee I know has studied, perfectly mirrors what Heine and Freud are doing in Luca. Freud arrives at the universal nature of dream dynamics through the elemental particularities of the dreamer's specific associations. So the associative framework is particularized by Freud's narrative context of two Austro-Hungarian Jews from different regions of the empire, expertly discussing the nuances of church art as they sit in a Middle European train carriage. Okay, that's the scene. Creating his narrative setting, Freud blends two discernible forms of Jewish linguistic expression. The first is his utilization of the train motif that is a mainstay of 19th century Jewish humor, and that is explicitly depicted in his 1905 text. And you can read Ruth Wissy on this. Combined with the familiar set piece is a motif resonant of Heine, whose hyphenated Jews of Lucca, educated in secular European culture, observe, and I quote, "You can bind my eyes and take me to an art gallery in Florence, and every painting you've put in front of me, I can tell you the painter who painted it, or at least the school they belong to." Uncannily present in its absence from Freud's dream associations is the recognition that Signorelli's first name is Luca, similar in pronunciation to the setting of Heine's story. So Freud really does hide his tracks. Sardonically, Heine reduces what in earlier times had been the idealized domain of transcendent religious faith to its down-to-earth value as practical utility in daily life, a unique marker of an adaptive Jewish social form also recognizable in the 350-year-old culture of Iberian conversos, the descendants of forcibly baptized new Christians under the lethal force of the Spanish Inquisition, which was still operative during Heine's lifetime. Self-consciously aware of a similar social imperative, facing societal contempt and disability rather than the auto de fe, Heine's newly Christian Jewish characters affect a similar pragmatic stance. The fantasy German reader of Freud's Hirsch Hyacinth joke immediately recognizes the impossibly obstructed societal dead end of Jewish striving, whether for character Hirsch Hyacinth or author Heinrich Heine. Heine's vocalization of Hirsch Hyacinth's contempt shifts the narrative locus of Jewish suffering, highlighting its interior dimension of self-hatred. Hirsch Hyacinth's rebellion turns against Jewishness itself, whereas Freud's interpretive sensitivity toward the shape given to the thought by the poet addresses Heine's more expansive critique of insoluble cultural prejudice in regard to the problem of being Jewish in enlightened Europe. This is what Heine says. "You can keep your old Jewish faith, doctor. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemies. Gives you nothing but scorn and shame. I tell you, it's no religion at all, just a lot of hard luck. I try to avoid anything that could remind me of it. And since Hirsch is a Jewish word and means hyacinth in German, I even gave old Hirsch his walking papers and now sign my name, Hyacinth, collection agent, operator extraordinaire, and taxator. Fortunately, my signet ring already has an H on it. I don't have to get a new one engraved. I assure you, your name matters a whole lot in this world. Your name is everything. When I sign Hyacinth, collection agent, operator extraordinaire, and taxator, it sounds altogether different than if I just signed Hirsch, and nobody can treat me like a common ragamuffin." Whether as Hirsch Hyacinth or as Heinrich Heine, the unsuccessful assimilation of Jews to cultural acceptability through the baptismal ticket of admission is doomed to fail. The German or Austrian Jews, socially imagined, was stuck within an irremediable racial category from which there was no exit. This is Freud's tacit social critique in the Hirsch Hyacinth interpretation, a subsidiary illumination requiring further inquiry along the path of primary illumination. Freud's discernment of the psychoanalytic method. The activity of psychoanalysis itself is an answer not to the question of Jewish science, but rather to the dead end of the racist bind in which the 19th and 20th century German Jew was imprisoned, desirous for assimilated acceptance, yet culturally precluded from sufficient attainment of this desire. Freud's self-formation as a scientist would pivot upon the same exclusionary social dynamic. Jewish definition within the German cultural imaginary was externally imposed rather than resultant intrinsically from Jewish civilizational contents. Indeed, identification with this environmentally aggressive racial definition was also reflected in Jewish self-representation. Heine himself is recognized as the epitome of this marginal situation, oscillating between idealized and denigrated states of identification, at times celebrating Jewish identity, at times in self-hatred, and at times aligned in non-Jewish identification with a secular environment, in a manner resembling today's psychoanalytic observations upon self-identity relative to external environments. Freud's affirmation of the scientific role allows him the social status of observer, wherein his societal definition of Jew permits him the access to the experience of society's other, believed in his time and place to be equivalent to society's congenitally diseased patient. Freud obliquely addresses this doubled assumption of biological incapability relative both to Jewishness and to emotional suffering in his 1909 Clark University lectures. There he upsets the characterization of the hysteric as genetically impaired through two contrasting images. The first is the biologized pictograph of hysteric as an overwhelmed shopper incapable of supporting multiple parcels. Freud's counter image is of Bertha Pappenheim's fluid facility in expressing herself verbally, together with Josef Breuer, across multiple European. What was that?
I think people need to mute yourself, please. If you're not talking, you're not speaker. If you continue, probably somebody had microphone on.
Okay, so what we have on the one hand is the notion that is current of the hysteric as being unable to do two things at one time, to which Freud says, what are you talking about? Look at Bertha Pappenheim as she moves through multiple languages with Josef Breuer, which is the first important case in studies on hysteria. Jews and their language remain significant markers for Freud in demonstrating universal capability against the 19th century anti-Semitic claim of Jewish cognitive and emotional incapacity. However, Freud strategically heightens his observational position by favoring the then common Jewish identification with the Gentile social imaginary through characterization of Jewishness as unheimlich or ghost-like. As Rank later documents through psychoanalytic interest in the double, this ghost-like quality is imputed to be an internal pathological characteristic rather than either an external projection upon a socially demeaned group or the result of complex individual identifications within a traumatizing social environment. 35 years before Freud's own work on the unheimlich or uncanny, Jewish nationalist Leon Pinsker had argued that the parasitic and ghostly Jewish tradition that he termed unheimlich would require the remedial action of auto-emancipation through realization of national territory and language, which is ultimately Zionism. Freud's interpretive method proves a very different route to the self's auto-emancipation. accessible universally both to Jew and Gentile, along the Bildung path of self-formation. For Freud, this requires a strategically reductive turning from Jewish civilizational contents in the service of elevating the psychoanalytic method. Such orientation extends beyond our contemporary popular, limited, faith-based understanding of Freud as godless Jew. Indeed, it is Heine, as cited by Freud in Jokes in their relation to the unconscious, who links such godlessness to Spinoza as Heine's and Freud's fellow unbeliever. And Heine, too, who construes the modern individual's self-authorizing autodidactic thinking as reflective of godless self-Jews. Heine also articulates a philosophical term that is enacted by Freud as assumptive behavior, the modernist idea of individual self-formation. Freud's developing method derives from observation of the world through the individualistic lenses of identity determined by Heine to have been ground by Spinoza. Definition of the individual is the basis of Bildung ideology of self-formation, in contrast to the late medieval social definition of the individual within the context of confessional or legal large group social definition. But powerful cultural definition of the other continues in social reality, despite modernity's post-Spinozan shift. Freud accommodates this contradiction by generating one of his own. He reduces Jewish particularity and identity to a cipher, while he continues throughout his lifetime to reference Heine as his literary alter ego, and so keeps Heine's incurable malady of Jewishness and continuous awareness as a subjectively meaningful form of psychosocial awareness. Throughout his career, Freud would retain a fine appreciation for Heine's presentation of the ironic, jarring social contradictions of the German Jew, with escape impossible from the self-consciousness of Jewish racial definition imposed both internally and externally. Freud identifies with Heine in addressing his own multiple conflicting forms of social identification. As Gilman observes, Heine, about whom one laughs, with whom one laughs, is seen as the epitome of both subject and object, both the means of analysis and the object of study. But where Heine is painfully overt in surfacing the cultural divide and marginality between dominant cultural judgment and the demeaned racialized Jew of the Gentile cultural imaginary, with which both Freud and Heine also identify, Freud attempts his own disappearance of Jewishness into an unheimlich silence. Famously, in Freud's 70th birthday address to the B'nai B'rith, he defines Jewishness as sharing many obscure emotional forces, which were the more powerful the less they could be expressed in words, as well as a clear consciousness of inner identity, the safe privacy of a common mental construction. Freud's pathway to the scientific discernment of psychoanalysis remains caught in a double bond. The first concerns his oscillating personal identifications with Jewish and non-Jewish cultural elements. Contrasting with this personal identification within an obscure and unlanguaged Jewish mental construction, both private and shared, Freud is also remembered for the doubled sentiment that he could not live anywhere else on earth after the World War I collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Indeed, in his elegiac Thoughts for Times of War and Death, written at the beginning of the global conflict, he would mourn the passing of universalized freedoms among the multiple ethnicities representative of Austro-Hungarian citizenry. And I quote at length, so I'm just going to skip through it. It's an ode to the wonderfulness of secularity and the ability to taste all of these multiple cultures without any prejudice. This, Freud's mournful recollection of a destroyed civilization, is a dream memory of Bildung, a socially mobile, pluralistic society, providing intellectual and aesthetic challenge and pleasure. Quite passionately, Freud articulates the freedoms of emancipation, only dreamed of by Heine, as the foundation of his own generational experience 2 generations later. He articulates a transit between the particularity of Jewish experience to the generality of secular citizenry after emancipation, with membership in the larger world of universalized enlightened thought. And he writes, from among the great thinkers, rightists, and artists of all nations, he had chosen those to whom he considered he owed the best of what he'd been able to achieve in enjoyment and understanding, masters of his own tongue. None of these great men had seemed to him foreign because they spoke another language. Neither the incomparable explorer of human passions, nor the intoxicated worshiper of beauty, nor the powerful and menacing prophet, nor the subtle satirist, and he never reproached himself on that account for being a renegade toward his own nation and his beloved mother tongue. This is what Freud writes about himself in 1915. But of course, there's some twists. These are Freud's individualized choices of writers and thinkers with whom he wished to identify and from whom he derived the productive contents upon which his own creative thought emerged, as shown above in his intellectual engagement with Kant, Lipps, Hemans, Heine, and Spinoza. Freud, the ardent and representative son of Bildung, the German language ideology of educative self-formation, discloses a difficulty that otherwise becomes effaced in his development of psychoanalytic method. The continuing fact of particularistic experiences and civilizational contents, including language and expression, from and through which individuals strive to express the universality of the human condition, and with
Ian,
it his
Ian, could you kindly wrap up soon? We need some time.
All right. The fact of Freud's use of a text written by a Jew deeply ambivalent about his Judaism, about a Jew both gleefully Jewish in communicative expression and superficially willing to repudiate Judaism, all in explanation of the psychological move of doubling, an exegesis of competitive conflictual levels of psychic process, each actively functional and glorious compromise, also satisfies the anti-Semite's characterization of psychoanalytic Jewish science, of Jewish practitioners with reference to texts penned by Jews, expressive of Jewish aspiration in recognizably communicative style, and seeking cultural change, radically challenging the status quo. The analytic haters of psychoanalytic Jewishness are reduced only to simple crudity. The Hittite nose, the charge of Phariseeism or petty trading, or the adolescent slur in the translation word game indicates the twinning of hateful envy and impossibility of the eradication of Jewishness, explicitly championed by Ernest Jones. Like the composition of a babka, with its chocolate and yeasty cake, mixing in prominent and less prominent bands, Jewishness simply can't be excised from psychoanalysis. True, Jewish students might be humiliated by anti-Semitic teachers and ugly power relations, as The Guardian reports in the clinical psychology program at George Washington University. But removing the Jew from psychoanalysis is as impossible as removing the straight G. Jones Yid from the Yid. Like the Hebrew Bible and the Talmud, psychoanalysis stands remarkably as a defiantly Jewish contribution to Western civilization.
Thank you. Thank you. Comments, questions?
Thank you so much.
Please raise your hand if you have a question or comment.
I wanted to ask Ian if Ian could address, Ian, can you address please like the parallels with today, you know, what you're talking about in your paper?
Yeah. For this one pristine moment that is illustrated by Freud, the Jewish condition is both placed front and center and denied in the construction of psychoanalysis. Okay. Today we have the obverse. We have the claim that Jews should sort of be exempted from the doing of psychotherapy, blacklisted, and that this is a universalized science that isn't related at all to any kind of culture. especially the Jewish culture. So this is a contradiction that Freud would get a kick out of, because in fact, his whole doubling is about erasing Jewish language while he's speaking in a Jewish language. And the only time he affirms Jewish language is in the translation of the ego and the id into Hebrew, which is sort of a double triumph late in his life. But it's the impossibility of getting rid of us while this is our creation. I should say, if you follow the trends in the current vernacular of psychoanalysis and how generations change its understanding, we might think that the post-Kleinean shift from an overtly Jewish set of practitioners to practitioners represented by by Bion and Winnicott, who were of Protestant origin, might suggest a shifting from a Jewish psychoanalysis to a Protestant psychoanalysis. That's what they think in Ireland. But I've just checked the current popular readings of the PEPWeb, and it seems that names like Klein and Hyman and Betty Joseph are back on the list of popular readings. So we've been re-Jewified.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you.